And our final presentation tonight is Michael Birtwistle from the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. Michael.
Thank you. Right, hello everyone. Pages in order. So I was really pleased when Gavin asked me to speak at one of these events, but I was wondering if he's getting a little short on speakers for Data Bytes simply because, as a fit for an event builders showcasing interesting government data projects, we're neither quite government insofar as we're notionally independent, and we're not doing interesting things with data. But what we are interested in is what other people are doing with data, and ultimately how we maximise the benefits to society of AI and data-driven technology. So even though I think I'm in a room full of data geeks, there's a good chance you haven't heard of us yet, and that's probably because other than our strategy, we haven't published anything, although that's going to change very soon. So who are we and what are we trying to do? Well, we've been set up by government to advise government on how we make sure we maximise those benefits of AI. And that means understanding how we develop and deploy that technology ethically and safely. How do we define the bounds of that nebulous phrase, AI and data-driven tech? The short answer is we don't. And the long answer is that if you're working with data very broadly, be that actual machine learning techniques, big data analytics, or any kind of slightly less fancy data science, or if you're making policy decisions about how data should be used or collected, we're probably interested in how that work might impact on society. And how do we achieve that aim of maximising the benefits while we try to understand what the risks and opportunities are that are presented by AI, and try to understand how prepared our governance systems are to respectively mitigate or take advantage of those risks and opportunities. And by governance, we mean that in the broadest sense here. We mean law, we mean regulation, corporate governance, guidance and support, and so on. And we have a single formal power at the moment that we'll be making use of, and that is that the government has to respond to our recommendations. We're a very new organisation, and as such we're still figuring things out. We're going to expand our capabilities and tighten our scope as we understand where we can add value. But for the moment, we're developing a few different types of outputs to make this tangible. And what I'm going to talk about today is a single bit of that puzzle, which is the accessibly phrased AI Barometer. I'm just going to set that first in some of the other work we're doing, just because it will make a bit more sense. We've got a series of short, medium and long-term projects we're working on. At the longer end of things, we've got teams running two major reviews on algorithmic bias and on online targeting and profiling. I'm not going to dwell on those now, but feel free to ask me about them in the Q&A. And then we have work that sits under my team in the centre. We've got snapshots, which are intended to be short, responsive, accessible papers on live topics of public concern and interest that are aimed at clarifying facts, issues, themes. And the first of these will be coming out at the end of this month on deepfakes. We've got others lined up in the near future on smart speakers and voice assistants, AI and insurance, and facial recognition technology. And the idea here is just to set out what the options or next steps might be around the issues identified. We're also running projects go by the working title of zoom-ins, any better words on a postcard. And these are really about exploring those options in detail, carrying formal recommendations to governments on where the gaps are in existing regulatory and governance frameworks. And we're doing an initial publication around ethical data sharing models on that. And then finally, we've got the AI Barometer, whereas our other work takes an in-depth look at particular issues or applications. We also need to be able to look across the whole landscape, understand those risks and opportunities presented by the tech, and help policymakers understand what needs most attention. So our problem space for the barometer is broadly, how do you help government in a very broad sense understand all the risks, opportunities and governance gaps around every application of AI and data-driven tech, including which are the most important in every context and sector, now and in the future, in less than a year. And that's a bit of an exaggeration. That is the problem we eventually want to have an answer to with more time and resource. But we will be publishing a first output towards the end of this year that begins to answer some of these questions in some contexts. How are we hoping to do that? Well, what I'm going to describe is very much a work in progress, and we expect it to look very different across subsequent iterations. So with that proviso, the first thing we're doing is we're cutting it down to 5 sectors to make the task reasonable. Secondly, we're adopting something of a mixed methodology. We're happy to be corrected on this, but we haven't found there to be an established methodology for articulating, measuring and prioritising all of the ethical risks that this sort of technology presents, much less alongside all of the sort of opportunity costs of not being ready to take advantage of the potential benefits. There are approaches from corporate risk, from civil contingencies, from general impact assessment tools, and so on that have useful elements, but any one of those approaches for looking at the issue, all of these issues, isn't quite right. And the main reason for that is because the range of risks and opportunities are so broad. This is a non-exhaustive list of some of the common themes we're seeing. We're trying to map out everything from the impact on an individual of an algorithmic decision-making process to physical harms, to public confidence in institutions, under and over to confidence in technology, market effects, individual rights, and so on and so on. And there are a huge amount of lenses that you can look at this through, and it's not really easy to bring a sort of accessible conceptual clarity to the sort of many levels and sort of types of abstractions that you can make around these potential sort of harms and opportunities. But we have to start somewhere. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a typology and a hierarchy of those risks and opportunities. And I should stress that we're not in any way trying to build some kind of objective measure or formal taxonomy around these issues, but we are trying to add some structure so that we can help build a sort of common picture and language around these issues as we go forward. And we're trying to do so not only around that sort of high conceptual level on the previous slide, but also expressed through risk statements of how these manifest in context, because it's impossible to judge the need of how urgently we need to deal with some of these without really looking at context. So the sort of typical example is the need to be able to explain a machine's decisions in cancer diagnosis might be quite low if you know that the machine is very accurate, but that may well not be true if it's making decisions about people's creditworthiness, no matter how accurate you think it is. So these are just some sort of examples that I've picked out. This is roughly where we're up to. We're putting together hundreds of these across the sort of 5 sectors that we've picked out. The next stage is building sort of expert sector panels to add to these, to refine them, prioritise them and really get into the detail of them. We want to build on the sort of the expertise that already exists and help translate that to government and make sure that we are talking to and convening sort of lots of different communities so that we don't miss anything. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully some of that's been interesting to some of you. We're still very much learning about the best way of doing this. We're particularly interested in talking to you if you're doing interesting things around AI, data, and the impacts of that. If you've got any views on how you do this, on methodology, or if you're a policy maker and have thoughts on what it's going to be useful for you to hear from us. 4 seconds.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's a nice small remit you've got yourself there. Who would like to ask questions of Michael? We've got a question down the front. We've got a question back there as well. Let's start with those two. So one here and one there.
Hi, Michael. One of the issues... Oh, sorry. One of the issues we're facing with, in terms of the work we're doing in Newham, is about children, adults, and using AI in sort of the public health space as well. And I just wondered what the sectors were and whether it was too late to make a plea for local government.
Eve Sampson, I run the Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament, and this is something which is shooting up the policy agenda. My committee is just doing an inquiry into privacy and the digital revolution. So how are you going to make sure that your work's fleet-footed enough to influence thinking which is happening now?
Thank you.
Right, thank you for those. The Barometer's 5 sectors don't include local government, but our major review on a bias does. So in fact, they are taking a sectoral approach, and one of the sectors that they're very interested in is the use of sort of predictive analytics in things like social care interventions and so on. So if you like, I'm very happy to put you in touch with those colleagues, and that's going to happen sort of later this year. How do we be fleet-footed enough? That is something we're struggling with. It's one of the reasons that we have created these sort of quicker formats. The sort of the snapshots I mentioned are 1 month sort of papers. We spend that, we get it out, we sort of put our mark down about it. I suppose a constant tension here is the need to be thorough and evidenced, and the need to be able to move with the debate. What the sort of the speed of the debate we're seeing around facial recognition technology, around lots of different aspects of this tech is very fast, and it will move on without us if we're not careful. So it's something we're very alive to. I suppose part of what we're doing this first year is understanding what we think about the landscape in general, understanding what principles we want to adopt. Once we're in that position and once we have a sort of ground level of understanding of all of these sorts of issues, we'll be able to be a lot quicker and more responsive.
Thank you. Next set of questions to Michael. So got one there, got another one down here, and was that a hand I saw at the top? Yeah. In fact, I think we may have got 4. Maybe we take all 4.
What you're doing is very interesting, but as you've said, it's very complicated and it's a very wide landscape. And I'd just like to ask, Kevin McConway again, I'd just like to ask about 2 different aspects of that. One is you mentioned the snapshots of items of public interest and concern, and obviously public interest and concern comes into a lot of what you do, and what methods do you actually use for determining what the public are interested in and concerned about, and what efforts are you making to ensure that this isn't, let's say, too metropolitan? I'll stop there.
Yes, Hartley Miller again. The question of what is important and what are the implications of the technologies doesn't just affect the individuals, it also affects the system in which society operates. So the question to you really is, to what extent are you going to comment on things like the impact of cryptocurrencies on the financial system and other wider questions?
Thank you. If we take the question from the back while we pass the mic forward.
As a citizen and watcher of AI, I wonder what what applications of AI you're most excited by and which ones you're most scared by.
Okay.
And we'll take a 4th as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it sort of slightly follows on from one of the earlier questions, but in terms of the fact that security is one of the things you're looking at, and that a lot of the innovations that we're seeing are disruptive. You might say, and the people using phrases like hacking society, and we've seen some of the effects of, things like the emergence of like the Uber network, and on the other side of things, sort of hacking in social sense to influence elections and that kind of thing. I just wondered how you, or if there is a way of kind of drawing the line between the things that are inevitably going to change and we should be ready to accept those kind of changes because that's the flow of things, or where you would sort of be advising, actually we need to put a stop to this because I can see this growing like Topsy or what have you.
Thank you.
Okay. Big range of questions, so I'll try and deal with them quickly. How do we pick our issues? At the moment, it's a spreadsheet, and it's an issues tracker of sort of everything that we come across in our reading that seems concerning, and that really is a very, very broad range of issues. Ultimately, what we're trying to do with the barometer is give that sense check of where, or that heat map of like, what are the things that we really need to be picking out. So we're very alive to the fact that you're only going to get sort of people's perceptions through asking them what they're worried about, and what we're trying to build into the barometer and our process is not just picking up on those things, and that's why we're trying to talk to such a wide range of people. We don't just want the sort of the things that we come out to be responses to very, very hot topics in the media like lethal autonomous weapons and so on. We want it to be a very broad range of things that affect people's lives, whether that's credit scores or whether it's impact on agriculture and so on. We're trying to be broad with that. I'm going to have to be quicker on these answers. To what extent are we looking at systemic issues and other technologies? We're not necessarily prioritising technologies like blockchain at the moment because there is so much just around machine learning that we think we need to deal with first. That said, the risk statements that I was highlighting earlier, some of those are about broader things like confidence in institutions, and we need that to be on our radar. We need to be looking not just at the sort of direct impacts, but those further down the line and those larger ones. So that's something very much on our mind. Question on to what extent are we going to comment on disruptive technology? To some extent, we don't really have a mandate to tell people what's ethical and what's not. What we have is a mandate to advise government as a system for democratically deciding what to do about things, where the issues are. So that's fundamentally where our starting point. When we have more time to dive into issues around the major reviews and so on, we may get more specific about those larger disruptive or market effects and so on. But we need to be a bit careful about what we've been set up to do and why we're there. Finally, applications most scary and excited. I think as a general observation, it's usually not the things that people worry about in the press that are the things that are the most worrying. I think some of the, it's often the bits of technology that you don't realise are there and you don't realise are impacting on the decisions that are made about you that I think are the ones that are an area of concern for at least me. I think I'm out of time, but thank you very much. And please do come talk to me if any of this was interesting to you.